All right, let's dive into this idea of sin. We're going to be looking at a Christian educational text called Adventures in the Story of Hope.
Yeah, this book lays out like 8 essential truths from the Bible. We're going to zero in on truth number 3, sin.
Sin, okay.
Now, before you think this is just a Sunday school lesson, let me assure you, this deep dive, it's for anyone who's ever made a choice they regretted or wondered about the consequences of their actions.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. We're going beyond the religious context to uncover some universal truths about, like, human nature. So, how does this children's book actually define sin?
Well, it really boils down to disobeying a higher authority. The book uses the story of Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit as like a prime example.
Ah, the classic tale of temptation. But it sounds like it's not just about making a mistake. The book emphasizes this idea of a deliberate choice, right, to go against the rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve knew what they were doing. They weren't just careless. They were like directly disobeying a command.
Right.
And that choice, according to the book, had some serious consequences, not just for them, but for all of humanity.
Whoa. Okay, so this is where the idea of the fall of man comes in, right? The book seems to suggest that Adam and Eve's choice to disobey created this like ripple effect,
Right.
leading to all sorts of problems in the world.
Yeah, things like fighting, selfishness, even war are all tied back to that original act of disobedience. It's presented as like a turning point in human history, a shift away from innocence and towards a flawed nature.
That's a pretty heavy idea. Makes you wonder about the choices we make every day and whether we're all carrying this inherited tendency to, make the wrong call sometimes.
Yeah. And the book doesn't just focus on the act of disobedience itself. It also highlights the role of temptation. There's this really interesting section where they delve into how Satan, who's portrayed as like a cunning manipulator, tricked Eve into eating the fruit.
I'm curious to hear more about that. What kind of tactics did they use to make the Satan character so persuasive?
Well, they describe him as a master of deception. He like twisted God's words, downplayed the consequences of disobedience, and even suggested that God was holding back something good from Eve.
It sounds like they're drawing a parallel to those moments in our own lives where we're tempted to do something, we know we shouldn't. There's always that voice whispering in our ear, trying to justify our actions or convince us we won't get caught.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The book might be using a fantastical story, but it's tapping into this very real human experience, that internal struggle between knowing what's right and being tempted to do the wrong thing.
So even though this is a children's book about a religious concept, it sounds like there are some pretty relatable psychological insights woven into the narrative. Makes you think about the times you face those like forbidden fruit moments in your own life, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we'll be digging into further. We'll explore how this book presents the consequences of sin and whether it offers any hope for redemption. But first, we want to hear from you. Have you ever felt that pull towards something you knew you shouldn't do? What was your forbidden fruit? And what happened when you took a bite? We've been talking about this concept of sin, like as it's presented in this children's Bible storybook, Adventures in the Story of Hope,
Sure.
right? And how it connects to that universal experience of temptation, that we all face. But the book doesn't stop at just defining sin. It goes on to explore the consequences, right?
That's right. And it doesn't shy away from the severity of those consequences either. Remember, this book is geared towards children, but it presents this like pretty stark view of what happens when you stray from the path of righteousness, so to speak.
Yeah. They use this phrase, eternal death, as the ultimate punishment for sin, which sounds pretty intense even if you're coming at it from a purely like metaphorical perspective.
Exactly. The book presents God as a holy and just judge who can't simply ignore wrongdoing. Now, we can, set aside the theological implications for a moment and think about what this idea represents on a deeper level. What does it mean for our actions to have lasting consequences, even consequences that extend beyond our own lifetimes?
That's a powerful question. It makes me think about the ripple effect of our choices, how they impact not just ourselves, but the people around us and maybe even future generations.
The book uses this very dramatic language, but I think what it's trying to get across is this idea that our choices matter. They have weight. It's a concept that resonates even outside of a religious context we've all experienced, like the feeling of regret, the knowledge that we could have done things differently, that our actions had a real impact on the course of events.
It's almost like saying we're all accountable for our choices. Even if there's no divine judge, like keeping score, there's a sense of internal accountability, a
Yeah.
reckoning with our own conscience that can be just as powerful as any, like, external punishment.
I think that's a really insightful way to interpret it. The book might be framing it in terms of divine judgment, but that underlying message is about the responsibility we have for our own actions and the impact those actions have on the world around us.
Makes me think about, like, the idea of redemption. Whether it's possible to make amends for our mistakes, or at least learn from them and move forward in a more positive direction.
That's an interesting point, and it's something the book touches on as well. It suggests that while sin has these like dire consequences, there's also a path towards forgiveness and restoration.
Okay, so even though the book paints this pretty bleak picture of the consequences of sin, it's not entirely hopeless. There's a glimmer of light, a suggestion that we can find a way back from our mistakes.
Precisely. And I think that's a really important message, especially for children who are still developing their moral compass. It acknowledges the gravity of wrongdoing, but also offers the sense of hope and possibility. It suggests that we're not defined by our mistakes, that we have the capacity to learn and grow and become better versions of ourselves.
Now, I know we've been focusing on the more serious aspects of the book, but I have to say, I'm impressed by the way they managed to make these complex concepts, like, understandable for kids. They use such vivid language and relatable examples.
I agree. And it's not just the language. It's also the way they structure the lessons. Remember how they described Satan's rebellion as a kind of government overthrow? That's like a brilliant analogy for kids to grasp this concept of challenging authority and the potential consequences that come with it.
And they don't shy away from the emotional aspects either. They really try to capture the drama of the story, the internal struggle that Ida faced, when she was tempted by the serpent.
What I find fascinating is how they encourage kids to like act out the story, to literally step into the roles of Adam and Eve and experience the temptation and the fallout firsthand. It's a very active, experiential approach to learning.
It's like they're saying, okay, here's the story, but don't just read it passively. Put yourself in their shoes. What would you have done? How would you have felt?
Exactly. It's about encouraging empathy, critical thinking, and self-reflection. And I think those are valuable skills for anyone, regardless of their age or religious beliefs.
So we've talked about how the book defines sin, the consequences it presents, and even the possibility of redemption. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd like to turn it back to you, the listener. Have you ever felt the weight of a choice, knowing that it could have long-lasting consequences? How did you navigate that situation? Did it change your perspective on the concept of sin or wrongdoing in any way?
We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Share them with us on social media using the hashtag DeepDiveSin.
We've spent this episode exploring this whole concept of sin through the lens of adventures in the story of hope. And it's been fascinating to, unpack how a children's book tackles such a complex and often heavy topic.
Yeah, and we've seen how the book frames sin as disobedience to a higher authority, using the story of Adam and Eve to illustrate the potential consequences of straying from a set of rules or guidelines.
We also talked about how the book presents, eternal death as the ultimate punishment for sin. But even setting aside the religious context, it seems like there's this broader message about accountability and the lasting impact of our actions.
Right, and I think that's what makes this conversation so relevant, even for those who don't, subscribe to the specific religious beliefs presented in the book. Like, we all have our own internal compass, a sense of right and wrong that guides our choices.
Right.
And when we go against that compass, we often experience some form of consequence.
It's like that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you know you've messed up, even if no one else knows about it.
Right.
That internal struggle, that sense of dissonance, can be its own form of punishment.
Exactly. And in that sense, the concept of sin can be seen as a metaphor for the consequences of violating our own personal code of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
It's about recognizing that our actions have ripple effects, not just on the world around us, but also on our own sense of self.
So even if we remove the idea of a divine judge, there's still a sense of judgment that comes from within.
Right.
We're constantly evaluating our own choices and actions,
Yeah.
and there's a certain level of accountability that comes with that.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting, because it suggests that maybe the path to redemption, or at least to inner peace, lies in aligning our actions with our values.
Right.
It's about striving to live in a way that feels authentic and true to ourselves.
So what does sin mean to you? We've explored the biblical definition, but how can we apply this concept to our own lives in a more personal and introspective way?
Maybe it's about those moments when we betray our own values, when we choose convenience over integrity, or when we prioritize our own needs above the needs of others.
Perhaps it's those times when we let fear or insecurity dictate our actions, leading us to make choices that we later regret.
Or maybe it's as simple as those everyday compromises we make, the little white lies we tell, the promises we break, the opportunities we miss because we're afraid to step outside of our comfort zones.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to reflect on what sin means to you and how you can strive to live a life that minimizes those moments of dissonance between your actions and your values.
Yeah, it's not about striving for perfection, but about cultivating a sense of self-awareness and making choices that align with the person you want to be.
And remember, even if you stumble, even if you make choices that you later regret, there's always the possibility of course correction.
That's right.
There's always the opportunity to learn from your mistakes, make amends, and move forward with a renewed sense of purpose.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.